Good afternoon. Welcome to the very first in our series of state webinars exploring the findings from American Farmland Trust's recently released Farms Under Threat, the State of the States report. Before we get started, let me run through a couple of logistical issues. Everyone has been muted, so no need to do that yourself. If you would like to ask a question, or make a comment, look at the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. The orange arrow at the top of that panel allows the panel to shrink and reopen. You'll see a question section of the control panel. Please type your questions and comments in there. We will allow plenty of time for Q&A during and after the presentation. We are recording this webinar, which will be posted along with other Farms Under Threat materials on our Farmland Information Center website. Let me now introduce myself. I'm Chris Coffin. I'm AFT's Senior Policy Advisor. I also direct our newly launched National Agricultural Land Network, which we'll talk about later. Co-hosting with me is Brian Bordage. Brian is based in Michigan, and we are excited to have Brian working for us as a consultant to advance our farmland protection efforts and the National Agricultural Land Network in the Midwest. We're also really lucky today to have joining us AFT's Research Director, Dr. Mitch Hunter. Mitch is Minnesota-based and is a primary author of the State of the States report, and Mitch will be joining us on the Q&A. We have included some audience polls in this webinar. Let's launch the first one now. We're interested to know what you think motivates people in Michigan to care about farmland protection. You can vote for as many as you want. And if you have a different answer, please feel free to share it via the question panel. Okay, well, that's interesting. That's a good, that's a very good mix. So before I turn it over to Brian to introduce our special guests, let me also introduce American Farmland Trust for those of you who are not familiar with us. We are a national nonprofit membership organization founded in 1980 that works to save the land that sustains us by protecting farmland, promoting sound farming practices, and keeping farmers on the land. Some know us best by our bumper sticker, No Farms, No Food. We have a number of regional offices, including offices in Illinois and in Ohio that serve the Midwest, and our national headquarters is in Washington. And now let me turn it to Brian, and hopefully our special guest has arrived.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, it looks like Director Mcdowell is here with us. I have a couple of special guests today I want to acknowledge. First of all, I would like to thank our NRCS state conservationist, Gary Lee, who along with some of his staff have made themselves available. And it's also my honor, special honor, to introduce the Michigan Department of Agriculture and Rural Development Director, Gary Mcdowell. Gary, can you hear us okay? I know he's there, so we'll make sure he can speak in a moment. Chris and I have had a chance to discuss the findings from this report with the director a few days ago, and we're really grateful that he's made time for us today. We know he's got a tremendous amount of things on his plate. We certainly understand that he may not be able to stay with us for the whole time. But we did want to start by asking a couple of general questions of the director. And I want to make sure that his microphone is working okay now. Gary, are you able to hear and speak with us now? Well, unfortunately, I know that he's on the call. We're not able to hear his audio at the moment.
So let's do this, Brian. Why don't we continue on? And let me walk through some of the findings, and then we'll see if we can figure out what the audio question is and bring him back in 10 or 15 minutes. And we'll hope that he will still be available.
Thank you, Chris.
Okay, so let's actually, you know what, before we do, since we were going to launch a second poll, Brian, can you do that now?
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that.
And so you see that this is what we are interested in, as you all are thinking about it, is looking forward. What do folks feel is going to be the greatest threat and cause of conversion? We know what it has been in the past 15 years as a result of this, but what we don't know is what is going to be in the future, and we're very interested to get your perspectives of what you think are the likely drivers of conversion going forward. Okay, so that's very interesting. That's still poorly planned development, generational transfer are at the top. Okay, so let's get into farms under threat. Today,
Chris, I think we might have the director if you want to try real quickly one more time.
Okay, let's do that.
Can you hear me, Brian?
Yes, Gary, I'm sorry. We had a little technical challenge. So before Chris moves on, I wanted to welcome you again and thank you for your time and the extra effort with technology we're all dealing with. We certainly appreciate your time in this very busy time, and I wanted to just ask you a couple of general questions before we do dive deeper into the Farms Under Threat study while we have you. The first is, what do you think Michiganders, why is it that you think that Michiganders should care about the loss of farmland?
Well, thank you so much, Brian, Chris, for the invite to be on this very important program. And also, as far as the technology, it's probably on my end. I'm very technologically challenged. I have learned a lot in the last couple of months. But in Michigan, we're very unique as a state. We're number 2 in the nation, diversity in the number of crops. Some people say we're not now, but we still feel we are. So we have a lot of very special crops, of course, that require special conditions to grow. In Michigan, we've been blessed, especially along our western shoreline, bordering Lake Michigan, to for the whole length of that shoreline, to have so much diversity, right from the southeast corner where blueberries are big, all the way up to Traverse City, where cherries, the cherry capital of the United States, is located. So it's so important to save that land because of how special it is for those crops to grow. And so we've been doing a lot here in Michigan. We were with our PA 116 program. We were seen as an example for other states, but with lack of funding over the years and that, we had fallen behind. I guess right now we're rated as basically keeping our heads above water at this time. But some of this, what you have in the program there, in your report, is really helpful for Michigan, especially like defining our low density residential use land, and also your PVR, which shows where the most significant, most vital and productive farmland is, and how important it is to have that information. Because we can talk about all we want, but what you've done here giving us the opportunity to actually show that these very valuable, especially crops, are under threat. And now we have the tool that we need. So I want to really thank you for what you've done there.
Thank you very much, Gary. A follow-up question is, how do you see that this information from the report might specifically help the department? Wondering if you've given that any thought.
Yeah, we just like I was just mentioning, that now that we actually have the data, which is so important when we want to move forward with a program where we can actually show what you have done here. It gives us a great tool that we can work continually. We'll work with our local units of government and also at the state level here that that we hopefully now will be able to show and actually prove that this land is under threat, and we do need to do what we can do to protect it and keep it farming. They're just like your scorecard there. It showed like in Michigan, there's 4 times more producers who are over 65 than under 35. Just that there alone is a big threat to farmland. We've got to be able to get our young people and help them any way we can to be able to continue farming in this state. Because every time you lose a farmer, you also lose or increase the opportunity that we could lose the land too.
Thank you, Gary. One last question. How can stakeholders, and we have a whole lot of them on our call, help to move some of the activities around these findings forward? How can they be supportive of MDARD and your efforts?
Well, it's now that we have the information, which is so available for us, that we can work collectively and we can do everything we need to do to help, like I said, help get young farmers in there, and also to look at ways that we can continue to fund these programs, to continue being able to save these farms. Some of our local localities, they do have a millage in place. Right now with Michigan, we haven't had a stable program for funding until 2016, where we were able to actually be involved with grants and that. And we need to continue to work together to promote that. And probably the most important thing is to get the message out to the general public, how important this is, because everything really starts at the local level. So we want to be a great partner there, working with our local folks and make sure we can do everything we can do to continue to preserve farmland here in Michigan.
Great. Thank you, Director McDowell. We really appreciate your time, all the work that the department has done in support of farming and our farm community. We look forward to our continued collaboration with you, and I personally look forward to our continued work with the Agricultural Preservation Fund Board. I appreciate your personal attention to that board. It's been fabulous to get to know you a bit and to see you show up in person at those meetings. So I want to thank you personally for that. And we'll welcome you to stay as long as you can. We'll have some questions and answers, but we understand if you need to leave. So
well, thank you so much, Chris and Brian. It's always great to see you too. And I know how hard you work and how committed you are to saving American farmland, and especially right here in Michigan. It's just really great to have you as a partner too.
All right, I think we're ready to launch another poll.
Director. No, I think we are sharing the poll results right now.
Oh, all right, great.
I'm hoping. Do we
Well, there
see
we
them? Can we see them?
Yep, we can see the results now.
Okay, well, right. Well, that's it's interesting. It is, I think, what we would expect of poorly planned development, generational transfer, and challenges on farm profitability, all of which we know have been causes of conversion. So let's go in and talk more about that. So let's talk about the state of the state, which is the second in a series of Farm Under Threats report. This is a national report, and State of the States paints a striking picture of the threats facing working farms and ranches in every state and documents the steps every state has taken to protect their agricultural land base from development. So here's an overview of the approach that we used. We used advanced spatial mapping to identify the threats to agricultural land. We conducted an in-depth analysis of state policy responses, and we're bringing this research together to raise public awareness, to inform state and federal policy, and to encourage more direct and permanent agricultural land protection. So now we are going to actually move into the website because we wanted to show everybody what this tool is, and so that everybody on this webinar knows how to be able to use it in the future. So this is at farmland.org/farms-under-threat. This is the welcome page. And up here in the right-hand corner, you would do the drop-down menu to Michigan. When we start, we'll start with the spatial data. And here you see the land cover and use with the legend of the land cover. Now, it is possible to zoom in. I am not going to do much of that because we have bandwidth challenges, as everybody does, but know that you can zoom in quite a bit. What is a first in this spatial analysis that we have done is that it maps woodlands associated with farms. And you can see this number over here, that it's more than 1.7 million acres that are woodlands associated with farms. This is different than forest land. But again, 7.8 million is cropland. So moving on then, let's look at productivity, versatility, and resiliency. These PVR values are a first ever assessment, are a first ever assessment of agricultural land quality. The index was developed with a national panel of experts. The higher PVR values indicate higher suitability for long-term intensive crop production, especially for food crops such as fruits, nuts, vegetables, and staple grains. We used these PVR values to identify nationally significant land. And here is a map of that. This is identifying what we consider to be the best land in the country for producing crops, especially human edible food crops. About a little over a third of the agricultural land in the US is considered nationally significant. And you will see that Michigan has a high percent of nationally significant land. 66% of its agricultural land is considered nationally significant. So then let's go to conversion and the conversion of agricultural land, where we want to spend the most time. And you will see here that you can also download the conversion summary, which is a very useful tool if you want a 2-page document with these key findings that you can use in your work. You can put it on your website, you can give it to state legislators, you can do all kinds of things with it, and we encourage you to download those highlight summaries. But let's go over here then and look at a little bit of detail. So the conversion data we used was from a 15-year period And here's the sort of details of how conversion, the amount of land that was converted and the type of conversion. Remember that this 15-year period from 2001 to 2016 was a period of historically low housing starts. But even then, you see that there was a fairly significant amount of conversion. So we mapped two different types. The first is urban and highly developed land use, or UHD is our acronym. This includes the traditional culprits in farmland conversion, expanding residential, commercial, and industrial areas. Urban high-density development is largely found in cities and towns, but this category also includes rural, industrial, and energy production sites, including oil and gas well pads and solar panel installations. The second type, which you see is far more prevalent in Michigan over this time frame, was low-density residential. This is the first effort of its kind to quantify the extent of large lot housing on the agricultural land base. LDR areas range from lower density subdivisions to rural areas where more and more individual houses are being built. So you can see that, again, more than 80% of the conversion in Michigan over this time was to large lot residential development. And this is, it's not always easy to see this. This is fragmentation of the landscape. It also shows that our analysis, as you can see over here on the right, that agricultural land that was in low density residential in 2001 was 11 times more likely to be converted to high density development by 2016. I want to show you a couple of other features on this website. You see the download summaries, but the other useful bit of information is over here on the reports and data. And here you can see, if you were interested in learning more about the PVR fact sheet, here it is, about the geospatial data layers, which are available for folks. Mitch can talk about that in the Q&A. So there is a lot of information, technical information, if you're looking for it, that can be found on this website. So let me switch now to the policy scorecard. That our intention with this scorecard is to highlight effective elements of state policies that address the three main drivers of agricultural land conversion. What are these drivers? These are poorly planned development, weakened agricultural viability and profitability, and the fact that land is most vulnerable when it's transferring between generations. And we know that that is there's a significant land at risk in Michigan and across the country. While AFT has been at the forefront of federal and state policy development around farm and ranch land retention and protection since our founding, this is our first effort at a comprehensive state policy scorecard. We could not map, we could not identify all the policies that help to support agriculture and farm viability, but we took the ones that we felt were most important to agricultural land protection and retention, and that have been adopted by at least 10 states. So looking at, again, the policies that we looked at permanent purchase of agricultural conservation easement programs. These are voluntary, where you pay, typically state governments will pay for conservation easements. Then we looked at land use planning and growth management and the relationship between states and counties and municipalities in terms of whether there is plans at the state level, whether there is consistency required at the local level with the state level plans, and whether there is a regulatory approach to any of that. We looked at property tax relief for agricultural land. Again, this is typically use value assessment. In Michigan, it's PA 116 that again gives a differential tax rate for agriculture. We looked at district programs, which are in 18 states that focus on a number of these tools. Some of them have permanent or temporary restrictions on the land in exchange for some amount of financial benefit, or they allow for special protections for agricultural land. Then we looked at farm link programs. These are programs that are focused on trying to match farm sellers with farm seekers. And lastly, we looked at state leasing programs, and these are this is looking at policies where a state is providing state-owned land to farmers for farming, and whether they are doing that proactively, and how farm-friendly those type of leases are. So looking at Michigan, you can see that it's right on the median for this purchase of agricultural conservation easements. It's about median on land use planning. It's on the high side, as we talked about, on PA 116, and it doesn't have an ag district program or a farm link program, and it gets a little bit of credit for state leasing. So let me then just show you right quick how you can look then at these scores. Let's look here, for instance, at the PACE program and where Michigan ends up on it. And here in Michigan is right here, as you can see across the line. It gets high marks for frequency of on-site monitoring of easements that it holds, but its low relative mark on average funds spent per capita reflect inconsistent funding for the program over the years. Let's look then very quickly, and I'm doing this quickly. You all can spend time on this. I want you to know sort of what can be looked at here. For property tax relief, you'll see that Michigan does really well. It's the third highest score, getting high marks for withdrawal penalties and for protecting and conserving agricultural land. And just one other note with this, if you go down to the bottom here, you will see how these scores were done, about how much points were given for each one of these particular categories. And then lastly, let's just look at state leasing as one last example. And coming down to Michigan, which is down here, that it seems that Michigan could do more to make its leases more farm friendly and to make the application process easier and more transparent for farmers. So I'm going to leave it there to allow time for questions. I hope that was a helpful cruise through the findings. If you do have questions, please do write them in now. And as we go out of the website, we are going to launch our third poll, which asks which of these policies or programs you think would be most valuable to focus on for Michigan. And please note that these you can have multiple answers, so it doesn't need to be just one. Okay, so that is really helpful to know that land use planning, purchase of agricultural conservation easements are at the top, as we would expect that. So on the policy front, the National Agricultural Land Network will be hosting a series of policy webinars beginning in the early fall, which we hope will be a way for those of you who want to learn more about particular elements of the scorecard. One thing that was missing from our spatial analysis is protected agricultural land, because there is not a comprehensive national data layer focused on agricultural land protected agricultural land protection. We are building this new database now, and you can see what we have collected thus far, and it's nice to see all these green dots in Michigan. If you have not heard from us and you hold your program, you have a program or your land trust that holds agricultural conservation easements, please type something in on the question bar so that we know who you are and we can reach out to you, because we do want to make this as comprehensive a database as we can. So let me now stop there and see if there are questions about the spatial or policy findings. Brian?
Yeah, we have some really good questions. I appreciate everyone's thoughtfulness in this regard. The first one I'll ask of you and Mitch was if the availability of fresh water was taken into account at all in regards to the PVR value assigned to farmland.
I think since we have the luxury of having Mitch on this webinar, that I will defer to Mitch on that question.
Okay, hi everybody. Can you?
Yep, we can hear you fine.
Okay, great. Well, good question. That's critically important in many parts of the country. We think about it more in the West, but I think that the Midwest, you know, I'm here in Minnesota, there's quite a bit of irrigation here, and especially for any kind of specialty crop production, but also for field crops, it can be very important. Need as a farmer and limitation on the productivity of that land. The answer, I don't have a super cut and dried answer for you. It's very difficult to assess either current, much less future availability of the wide variety of freshwater sources that you might use for agriculture, whether that's current precipitation, surface waters, or groundwaters. You know, those are all variable and changing over time, and with the effects of climate change, you know, upon us, there's a lot of uncertainty about the direction that this will go, or how fast it'll change. So thus far, we don't have a really direct consideration of the availability of fresh water, except for the fact that we do pull in some information from the cropland data layer. And we have some info, you know, the need for drainage or irrigation is also included in some of the important soils designations in, you know, prime soil categories, and also the limitations that are identified in the land capability classes. So those elements are brought in. For instance, if land has been kept successfully in agriculture over time, in part by virtue of being able to have access to irrigation, you know, that would be reflected in the designation of that land as cropland, for instance. But if that aquifer is on the edge of collapse, you know, we'd have to collect that information aquifer by aquifer around the entire country, which is pretty much prohibitive. So we don't have really prospective, forward-looking information on that at this point.
Thank you, Mitch. A very thorough answer, although, as you mentioned, somewhat complicated because some of those factors are included in the categorization of land by the USDA. So thanks again. I have another question. This person is asking, says, I have always heard that solar and wind energy is a tool that farmers can use to keep their farms profitable, thereby helping to preserve agricultural land. What is the viewpoint of AFT in regards to this?
Let me take a shot at that. That is a really good question, and it is one that AFT and others are grappling with around the country, because we are addressing competing demands of wanting to encourage and foster farm viability and profitable businesses. And we understand that there are opportunities around wind and solar and oil and gas, so in other places particularly. So I think that what has helped us with this analysis is that the PVR helps us to give us a better sense of the best land, and it's part of why we wanted to create this category of best lands, to say that all land is not created equal, and that if you are going to encourage renewable energy development, that it needs to be done as much as possible to put on marginal farmland, that land that is not considered nationally significant. So that is what we have been doing, a lot of work in some parts of the country. We have more additional information that will be coming out on that process of helping to sort of identify where to site solar and other renewable energy development. I would say that just on the, well, let me just stop there. We can talk about climate in a minute.
All right, thanks, Chris. The next question is there any way at all that we can reverse these trends of conversion to urban high density from low density residential development?
If we can reverse the trend to avoid, I guess I'm trying, if the question is, can we avoid going from low density residential to high density, I think the answer is, the ideal answer is that we try to avoid low density residential development where we can. And in many places, that's going to take more effective planning to do that. And, there are ranges of that effective planning that go from powerful voluntary incentives to the regulatory scheme. If the question is sort of, if you're faced with low density residential development now, I think the question is looking at any particular place and whether there is still land that can be effectively used for agriculture. Again, the challenge around low density development is the fragmentation that makes it difficult to farm. You've got non-farming neighbors who don't care for the noise, don't care for the odors. It's not to say that there's not possibilities to be farming profitable smaller parcels in what is a fragmented landscape. And if you can continue to, if that is still possible for those farmers who are working in that environment and it still works for them, that is great. But so I guess yes, if you can work with farmers who are dealing with smaller parcels and that it is a type of agriculture, and you can continue to encourage the viability of that type of agriculture, I think it is a way of avoiding conversion to higher density.
Thank you, Chris. And I was just going to add a note there and say that we do have some great examples in the state of efforts underway for some time in areas like the Old Mission Peninsula in Grand Traverse County and neighboring Acme Township, as well as the Ann Arbor Greenbelt, some areas of Kent County and its larger neighborhood, where there has been planning to identify significant agricultural lands to preserve over the long run, and where significant strides have been made to stem that loss. So would encourage the person who asked that question to look into the success of those efforts. I think that's about all we have time for with questions at the moment. So I'm going to ask for, oh, we have the next slide, thank you. I want to talk about what are we going to do with this information at AFT, and you know, what are where are we headed now? We recognize that time is not necessarily on our side in saving this important farm and ranch land, and we have just announced a very bold goal of doubling the amount of permanently protected farmland in the nation by 2040, and by reducing the rate of farmland conversion from 2,000 acres a day to 500 acres a day by 2040, as is demonstrated here on this slide. And then on the next slide, you can see that we're also undertaking a number of efforts to strengthen our overall work in this regard. The first of note is establishing the new National Agricultural Land Network as a mechanism to provide coordinated technical assistance and education, and strengthening relationships between farmland protection practitioners. As Chris mentioned, you're all invited to join the network. If you haven't, please consider doing so. There's no cost. We are planning some initiatives for later this summer and this fall, as Chris mentioned. We're looking to provide some new leadership in some key locations around the country that have been identified as in need of some additional support for farmland protection. We're working also to continue to look at how we ourselves as an organization can protect farmland, but also how we can do that in collaboration with others. I'm going to be focusing specifically in Michigan on how we can better work with our established local farmland preservation boards and look at their relationship or not with land trusts in their area, and how we might all better collaborate to address those areas of the state and areas that might be underserved in the state in terms of farmland protection expertise. So we have a number of things coming up. Also with the National Ag Land Network, we're planning some virtual forums in the Midwest region around the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, and also around the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, ASAP-ALE, as many of you know, to provide more information sharing amongst practitioners and information for those who may not yet be pursuing or utilizing those tools. So hopefully that gives you a sense of the direction that we're heading. And we're also looking at how we can be a resource around state policy development. We want to look at how we can be supportive of what more the state can do, how we can better analyze the information provided in this report as it relates specifically to Michigan, as we talked about earlier with the director, how we can strengthen or adopt coordinated efforts, and how we can capitalize on the unique opportunity we have right now to increase consumer awareness around food security and food system resiliency, and make the case for investments in farmland protection. also to address the looming challenge of the generational transfer of farmland, which we've discussed here today, and to be innovative in addressing the fragmentation of our farms through low density residential development, as we've also discussed. So we're all in this together. We hope that we've given you some more new powerful tools to work with. I encourage you to look through the website, and now we're going to see if we can't get a few more questions answered.
And thank you, Brian. While we're seeing if there are any more questions, let's go ahead and launch our last poll, which is what ways that people think that we can be helpful. Like, what kind of training would or assistance be helpful from AFT and the National Agricultural Land Network. We are looking to develop our programming around the network, so anything that we can do we want that programming to be the most helpful. So getting your thoughts on that would be great. And okay, so sharing these. Well, I'd say, Brian, we have our work cut out for us in terms of
Yes.
training and assistance. So that is great, because that is what we are hoping for. I see a question here, which is that dwellings are a permitted use by right in most agricultural zoning districts, and it would be very difficult to change that. Should there be a maximum lot size for non-agricultural uses aimed at limiting the size of low-density residential lots? Brian, you want to take a shot at that, or Mitch? Either of you have thoughts on that? Dwellings are, let me reread it, because dwellings are a permitted use by right in most ag zoning districts. Should there be a maximum lot size for non-agricultural uses aimed at limiting the size of those low-density residential lots?
I can speak to that briefly. It's a longer conversation about, particularly in Michigan, about our Zoning and Enabling Act and what laws designate what authorities to local units of government in regard to zoning. I think the thing to look at is, what are some communities doing that are creative and successful around this issue? You know, as most people I think on this call know, zoning is controlled at the local level, the local government level in Michigan. And that said, we do have a number of communities that are looking at how they can be more intentional around the kinds of residential uses and associated divisions of property that they're allowing in agricultural areas. One unique example I know of off the top of my head is in Peninsula Township, where the citizens have devoted significant resources to the protection of farmland. They allow for homes on protected farmland in the future with limitations, and they allow for those homes to be on a smaller lot than the typical lot size in the township. So that's a way to recognize that in in areas that are designated for long-term agricultural use, we don't need to use as much land necessarily for a home that's a part of a farm. So certainly those kinds of plans could be extended to other areas, and likely are being extended to other areas of the state that I'm not necessarily familiar with. But I think the important thing for all folks on the call is to realize that these decisions are made at the local level, and to become familiar with what those current regulations are. Oftentimes, I find that it's our agricultural friends who are most exasperated by zoning, because they feel like it unnecessarily eats up agricultural land. So a lot of times I think there's a win-win there with just more discussion and advocacy on the part of those local units of government.
Thanks, Brian. Mitch, do you want to add anything in on that?
You know, this really isn't my area of expertise, but I think it's an interesting question, and I think there's kind of a catch-22 in there. On the one, I want to say yes, and I think from a very cut and dried perspective, if you made that maximum lot size very small, then each rural residence that's not a farm would end up the smallest amount of of land possible. So maybe if you had a very restrictive maximum, I could see it being effective. It just would be hard to get past. On the other hand, if you make the maximum 5 acres or 10 acres, there's nothing to stop, those 5 or 10 acre lots proliferating like crazy across the landscape, and then you've really totally fragmented the land base. So I think a more complex, it's going to be more nuanced and complex, I think, than just putting a maximum on there, and really taking a look at the landscape as a whole and thinking about where the dwellings and the lots, or just, I guess, the lots themselves need to be smaller and compact to fit in with an urban landscape, and then where outside of that, you need to have larger farm scale properties, and ideally have systems in place to make sure those are actually operating farms.
Great, thank you, Mitch. Yeah, I would say, just to add a little bit, is that zoning is an area where a huge amount of flexibility and creative tools and thinking is needed to make it so that you are not taking away value that farmers have in their land, but yet you are trying to do exactly as this question is aimed at. So there's a lot more conversation that needs to be had about types of zoning tools that work to address sort of fragmentation of landscape. And again, it's one thing that we hope to do much more programming around with the network. We have time for probably one more question. And so, Mitch, let me put this one to you. Is how is this all in terms of agricultural land loss connected to climate change?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, that's a really important piece to make sure we address. And I think we're seeing more and more the ways that they're connected. So we're seeing that, acre for acre, there's no question that agricultural land produces far fewer greenhouse gas emissions than land that's been converted to housing or commercial use. We've done a couple of studies, not in Michigan, but in California and in New York. And we see that the greenhouse gas emissions from land that's been converted to development are 50 to 70 times higher than the agricultural land. And if you can preserve that land in agriculture and then at the same time promote compact development, that's where you really get the biggest win for greenhouse gas emissions, because you're limiting driving and heating costs and city services and lots of other things that create greenhouse gas emissions when you encourage density. And then you're also preserving the land. And when you keep the land in agriculture, then you have the opportunity to use regenerative practices, sequester carbon, do tree crops or other production practices that they themselves actually are building carbon in the system. And so there's just lots of positive benefits. And then as you're doing that, of course, there's a lot of other benefits for the environment in terms of water quality and wildlife, et cetera. So keeping the land in agriculture maintains all those opportunities. And then the real kicker is, securing the land base is critical, because if we don't, we could do all those good things and then have all those gains be lost. So if you don't protect the land in the wide variety of ways that we've discussed today, not just permanent protection, but if you don't protect and retain the agricultural land, then there's a big risk of backsliding. So farmers who are really committed to being regenerative and building their soil, if it ends up that their land goes into development, well, a lot of those benefits will be reversed. So we think the connections are strong. We also think, we need a resilient and diverse agricultural land base and food system to stand up to disruptions. And we've all seen, maybe more than ever before, how the food system can be disrupted in a time of crisis. And so, the resiliency in the long term requires a lot of factors. Healthy packing plant workers are important. Lots of different elements are very important. But the real base of it is going to be the land. So maintaining that productive and diverse agricultural system and food system, I think, is going to be critical for long-term resiliency to climate change and to other kinds of disruptions as well.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you to you, Mitch. Thank you to Brian. Thank you to Director McDowell. I don't know if you were still on, but we very much appreciate your leadership. We appreciate very much the leadership of many other elected officials, but particularly Senator Stabenow in terms of support for the Federal Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, as well as many others, but that again has been very important to allowing for permanent land protection in Michigan. Let me leave you with two resources. The Farmland Information Center is a clearinghouse that we run in coordination, in collaboration with NRCS. They have a telephone line that is actually answered, and they are there to provide you, these are AFT staff who provide information to landowners, to policymakers, to land trusts, to anybody who might be on the phone today if you were looking for a statistic, if you were looking for information about state policy, if you want to direct a landowner who's interested in protecting his or her land, there are many resources. And again, the National Agricultural Land Network, as we've talked about, is something that we hope people will sign up for. There's the information. If you want to be in touch, please feel free to be in touch with me. I am excited that we have two folks from Michigan who are on our steering committee that we have just finalized. That's Laura Riggin with the Grand Traverse Regional Land Conservancy and Becky Hutengov with Ottawa County Economic Development. So we are very grateful to the two of them. We are happy to have Michigan well represented on the steering committee. And we look forward to spending more time working with all of you on advancing farmland protection in Michigan. So with that, we appreciate your time. This has been recorded and will be made available on our website. We will send out a link. And we hope that you have a great rest of your afternoon. Thank you and take care.